Basing is a crucial and often overlooked part of miniature painting. However, a well-executed base enhances the overall aesthetic. It can reinforce a theme and provide a strong visual representation of the world they live in. In this video, I'll be sharing some of my favourite tips and tricks and techniques to take your Grimdark basing to the next level. I'll walk you through my approach to colour palettes, some weathering effects, and the little details that bring these bases to life. I'm Nate the Feral Painter, and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. So basing a miniature is often overlooked because many hobbyists focus primarily on painting the model itself, seeing the base as an afterthought rather than an integral part of the piece itself. It can also feel like extra work, especially after spending hours on a detailed paint job, but additionally, some may not even realise how much a well-crafted base enhances the final look, while others might even struggle with the materials and techniques needed to create a realistic environment. Typically, we spend hours on our miniatures just to glue them to the base and add some texture paste and a few rocks or tufts, and we don't really pay any attention to it, but skipping the basing can leave a model looking unfinished, missing the opportunity to fully immerse it in its intended world. From a narrative perspective, a well-crafted base transforms a miniature from just a figure into a character within a living world. It provides a context, and it can also tell a story and enhances the immersion of the overall miniature. Before building and painting your bases, it helps to plan ahead to ensure that they fit within the setting. First of all, I do like to define the narrative, and for this I mean like what sort of world does your miniatures inhabit? Is it a battlefield or a ruined city, a toxic wasteland, or a desolate alien planet? What story do you want your base to tell? Is it a plague marine walking through a festering swampland? Is it a crew of soldiers desperately holding on to the last line? Or could it even be a space marine boarding a chaos ship that's festering with years of decay and warp entities? Thinking about these narratives will give you some great ideas when it comes to crafting your base. I also like to gather some inspiration by looking at some photos, some game cinematics, movies, and even Grimdark artwork for some ideas. I also research some real-world environments like abandoned war zones, industrial ruins, or decayed urban areas, and the one that I'm painting in this video was inspired by the real place Chernobyl. I like to just go on Google and search some of these references, and also once you're over there, it's also a great idea to explore some textures. This could be just some simple photos of cracked concrete, some rusted metal, or even some scorched earth. It's also a good idea to consider the composition and scale of your bases, and you want to keep it balanced as too much detail can distract from the miniature itself. I like to think about things like the height and layers, and can you add the elevated platforms such as rubble or broken pipes, or even some raised platforms. But it's a good idea to ensure that the base doesn't overpower the model, and instead you want the base to complement the miniature itself. Typically, when I'm building a base, I like to have around 2 to 3 main features on my base. This could be some pipes or a platform, some cracked ground, some just industrial wreckage, or pools of toxic sludge. Alternatively, you could even use some features such as some broken buildings, but around 2 to 3 key features of your base will complement the miniature and bring everything to life. But taking some of these key points into consideration and planning ahead will help you massively when it comes to creating your bases, and it'll just help them overall feel more intentional and immersive to the model. Now let's see how all this works in conjunction with each other so that we can build our base. And to start with, I need a solid foundation, one that we can build upon. And typically I like to start off with some cork sheets, and these do come in varying sizes and thicknesses, and typically you get them in these sheets, which makes it perfect for tearing up and ripping into these jagged shapes. And I start off by just randomly placing, I'm not gluing anything out at this point, and this is where you like to play with the composition of the base, making sure everything's working, just trying everything out, a little bit like you would when you're kit bashing a miniature. You like to try little parts, make sure that they fit, and you can layer these atop each other, and once you're happy with that, then you can start to super glue them down. Once you're happy with the foundation, at this point we can start to flesh out the base and add some extra parts. Now these parts are going to be ones that are going to complement the composition of the base, and for this one I've just added some more rubble or some pieces that can typically be found in most 40k terrain kits, or ones that even come with most miniatures. You can also add it depending on the type of base that you're going to create. This is a good point where you can start to add like your trees and some other sections, but overall these parts are going to be parts that are integral to the foundation, but everything just complements the composition of the base. After this I'm going to add some smaller rocks and rubble, and this is going to represent some of the broken up debris or just general rocks that are in and around that terrain. Although these do look random and sprinkled on in random places, each part is placed with thought and intent, which is also going to overall, it's not just a good idea just to sprinkle everything and all these rocks in random places. Really think about the placements of these rocks, and these can either be glued with PVA glue or some super glue. There's also many places that we can turn to grab some natural craft parts, and these can be found in many stores, such as this mesh wire that I did find in some pet shops. That this is typically used for pet enclosures, and they do come in varying shapes and sizes, but the smaller that they come, that this is better and perfectly matches the scale of our miniatures. Different gauges of wires and cables can be found in most local DIY stores, but I'm pretty sure that most of us have got some old cables or wires lying around the house, which is perfect to add some additional piping or exposed wires. After this comes probably my favouriteest phase, which is the decoration phase, as I like to call it. And these are just elements that will enhance the overall base and set the tone and the scene of the miniature. These parts can be like story elements or anything that's going to add to the overall base and feel of the actual scene itself. And this is parts what are going to add to like the story and the narrative, and these elements can dramatically change the scene of any base, but they are still an integral part of the overall scene. Cocktail sticks make some great grave markers, or these can even act as some fence posters or just general spikes that have been attached to buildings. I also like to raid my bits box for anything that I can find that is going to go into this scene and add to the overall story, and these can just act as like remnants of war or a lost civilization. And of course, no Grimdark base is complete without the addition of some skulls. If you're going to be creating something that's more like a forest scene, then these can typically be found naturally in any of the environments that you might live close by to. If you just go for a walk through your general forest, I typically take a little bag with me, and any interesting parts or little plants or dead leaves or even just some twigs and roots that I find, I'll pop them in a bag, and once I get home it's just a case of washing these out in soapy water, and then once dry these can be glued down to your base. At this point is where you want to add the rest of your ground texture, and to start off with I've used some crackle paint. Crackle paint is one of my favourite products, especially when it comes to bases or even miniatures themselves, because it can be utilised in a number of different ways, and I like to add this up and around buildings as it tends to add a more realistic cracks effects for the weathering as that building starts to decay. But I've also added some to the base to make the ground look dry and cracked, and then atop of that I'm going to add some general texture paste. A cheaper alternative to this is some tile grout, and a bag of this, once you've mixed it with water, will last you an absolute lifetime. Before these texture pastes dry and whilst they're still wet, I like to get a little bit of ground mix, and most hobby stores sell these, or you can just go into your back garden and get some dried dirt and rubble, and I just sprinkle this in and around the texture paste just to add some variation. When it comes to choosing a colour palette for bases, it is crucial in the Grimdark basing because this sets the tone. It also enhances realism and helps the miniature stand out. A well chosen colour palette will reinforce the bleak, war-torn atmosphere, making the environment feel more immersive and lived in. For this, we can turn to dark muted tones like browns and greys and desaturated greens to create a sense of decay, while splashes of rust, dried blood or toxic sludge adds contrast and a narrative depth. The base should complement the model without overwhelming it, and using a slightly different shade from your miniature ensures it stands out while still feeling cohesive. Layering colours using washes or adding weathering effects like rust, dirt and grime create a natural age look that enhances the Grimdark aesthetic. Colour choices can hint at the setting: ashes grey for ruined city, reddish browns for battlefields, or sickly yellows and greens for a toxic wasteland. Choosing the right colours not only makes the base visually striking, but it also ties the whole miniature into its setting. Now, even though I like to take my time with my bases, I'm always looking for ways that I can speed up processes or cut little sections out just to help me move things on a little bit quicker and overall make the experience that a little bit more enjoyable. And for this, I'm sort of going to utilise a slap chop technique, if you will, like when we're painting our miniatures in the slap chop style. We can also utilise this when it comes to bases. So for this, I've primed it in a grey primer, and then I'm immediately going to come in with a lighter grey tone and dry brush it over the entire area. And like we do when we're painting our miniature with the slap chop technique using contrast paint, that is what I'm going to use to start to build up the tones for this base. So through my airbrush, I've loaded up some different brown contrast paints, and I'm just spraying these here and there and using the darker browns for the shadow areas, and this just allows me to get some nice tonal variation whilst also retaining those highlights. At this point as well, it's just a case of going in there then and base coating every other part of your miniature out, which it might look like there's a lot to do on here, but in reality there's not actually that much to do. It might just be some of the metallic areas and some of the details such as the skulls and any decorative parts that you've added around the miniature. If you've got any loose rocks, I sometimes like to come in with just one acrylic base tone or a couple of different brown tones or earthy tones and just paint a couple of different rocks in different colours, as not all rocks have the same shades or tone, and this just helps break up the actual terrain on the miniature. We're then going to come in with a unifying wash of Villainy Inks Goon's Grime, and I've applied this in a 1:1 ratio with mineral spirits and just applied it via brush, letting it go into all those cracks and crevices, and just applying this in and around all the miniature like we do when we're painting a Space Marine or anything like that, and just allow that to dry over 15 minutes. Now the reason I've done this as well is because one, the Villainy Inks are absolutely perfect to use against bases, and sometimes when we're painting miniatures and we're applying these weathering elements to them and we're just putting them on a standard base that don't really make sense, well, doing it this way sort of ties it into the base and we can sort of see where those elements are coming from. You know, if he's going through a dusty environment, then he's going to be covered in dust and all that sort of grime. We can now see why and where that grime is actually coming from, and everything overall just makes a lot more sense for the actual narrative. After that Goon's Grime has dried, applied. Again, with the reductive technique, I just come in with a little sponge or a brush and just start to clean up areas and just leave that dirt and grime in the crevices. Typically on the ground, I don't tend to do much cleaning up there. Maybe the odd rock, I might just clean it away. As where the ground, that's where most of the grime is and settled, and as our Space Marine or our character is walking through it, he's picking up some of that dust, and that's why it's on his clothing and his armor. When it comes to areas like the ruins or the rocks, it's important that you get something like a brush and turn some of these grimes into like streaks of grime, and this will just overall add to the weathering effects, making it look like it's been rained on and all that grime has started to drip down the building. To add some verdigris to the gold or bronze sections on the actual base itself, this was just a really quick and effective recipe. I first came in with Villainy Inks Colia Green and just applied this all over the miniature. I didn't actually come in with a removal pass. Now typically this actual enamel does dry satin, which will give you a bit of surface finish variation, but because we've got that goon's grime underneath it, what we've done already, this is going to help it push more into the satin to matte phase. And then just as one more additional colour tone for the verdigris, I'm going to come in with Villainy Ink's Decay of Death. Now this enamel dries really chalky and it's going to be perfect to set the tone for our verdigris, but I also apply some of this in and around the base, as I had an idea as this was like a radioactive apocalyptic world, and this just adds that little bit more visual interest to the scene. Villainy Inks Sector Rust and Ex Machina is great for creating some rust tones and an overall rust filter to your bases on any of the metallic elements. And then I just came in with some Dirty Downs Rust just to push this even further and create some fresh rust. With the upcoming Phase 2 of Villainy Inks, I did apply a small amount into the lower crevices just under the buildings of All Is Dust, and just like the Decay of Death, this dries really matte and chalky, perfect for any environment where you want to add some rust. And there's one final little addition to the base, which is optional because I felt like it just needed that little bit more. I added some more sprinkles of some ground mixture, and these were just sealed in with either PVA glue and water or some ground fixer. Also, Decay of Death or the All Is Dust is great for tying your miniature into the base itself, where it's running up onto the legs or the clothing. Alternatively, if you've gone like for a muddy scene, this could be mud splats up and around the legs just to tie it in. You could come in with something like some pigment powders and just dust this up onto the legs and in around the base. And that brings us to the end of this video. So if you have enjoyed it and you do want to learn more about the basing techniques and delve deeper into some of the techniques that we've used and some of the clips that you've seen in this video, and specifically some of the color recipes, then head over to the Grimdark Compendium, where we have a vast catalogue of videos where you can delve deeper into some of the techniques and recipes that we've shown and displayed in this video. Don't forget, the Trench Crusade sale is still live, and if you're looking for a dedicated course tailored to your faction, then head over to the Grimdark Compendium. I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me today, and I hope this video has given you the inspiration and insight to put that extra thought and effort into your Grimdark bases. And a well-crafted base can make all the difference, so take your time, experiment, and most importantly, have fun bringing your miniatures to life. I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and until next time, I will catch you in the next video.